So hello to everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I can see there's a couple more people I need to let in, so I'll just do that now. So hello to everyone that's just joined us and welcome back to our webinar series after our summer break. Now, we are delighted today to have Victoria Mason, who is a PhD candidate at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research. Victoria previously worked in the UK on the UK saltmarsh carbon code, and her research focuses on saltmarsh resilience to climate change driven stresses, particularly thinking about impacts and trade-offs in ecosystem services. We're also delighted to have Victoria today because Victoria was the winner of the Peter Jones Memorial Award last year, which is a prize for the best paper published by a PhD student or early career researcher. For any PhD students or early career researchers that are on the call today that has published a paper in the last year, you could win a prize of £500. The deadline to submit your application is the end of the month. Please go to our website. There is all the information and the form you need to complete to apply. So that's all for me. I will now hand over to Victoria. Can I please ask that everyone make sure that they are on mute and they stay on mute? We've got plenty of time for questions at the end, if that's okay. But if you want to put a question in the chat during the talk as well, that's also fine. Victoria, over to you.
Hello, yes, thank you very much, Jonathan, for the really nice introduction, and thank you for having me here, also very lovely. Yeah, so I'll get started. My name's Tori, or Victoria, as Jonathan told you, and I want to talk today a little bit about saltmarsh carbon, but particularly from a restoration point of view. So what benefits we might get from that, but also what trade-offs we should be thinking about. So perhaps first it's useful to introduce myself a little bit. So I'm from the UK, and I started off, I'm still very early in my career, so I'm doing my PhD right now at the NEOS, as Jonathan said. But I started off at the University of Liverpool, where I did my bachelor's in marine biology and in oceanography. And then I moved just down the coast to Bangor to do my master's a few years ago. And I did that in marine environmental protection during COVID time, which is why you can see me measuring a fish with a mask on, which was all very normal then, but it's now a bit strange. And then I did some work also on microplastics and marine benthic fauna. But then I hadn't quite had enough of North Wales at that point. So I stuck around for a little bit longer, and I first started out working as a research assistant with Sustainable Fisheries Wales. And then I was working with lobster stocks and going out on small fishing boats in kind of inshore areas, which was really good fun. And after that, I stayed again in Bangor for a little bit longer, and then started working as a research assistant on the UK saltmarsh carbon code. So that was very much the advent of my saltmarsh days, and where I got the bug a little bit for it, and has kind of led me to where I am now. Since then, I've moved across to the Netherlands, where I am now in the southwest of the Netherlands at the NEOS, and now I'm doing my PhD. So I'm looking at global change effects on saltmarsh ecosystem services, and I'm somewhere about halfway through that at the moment. So on to what I'm going to talk about today. So as you already know, I'm going to talk a little bit about saltmarsh carbon. I think that's a topic here that's been discussed quite a lot. So I'll try and hopefully add some different perspectives on that a little bit. But there are a couple of questions that I want to explore on the topic. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit just about how much carbon is stored, whether we can actually quantify that, and whether we can dig into why that varies so much across different sites and different locations. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what we don't know, which I think can arguably be as interesting as what we do. And then finally, I'll move on to a bit and what trade-offs do we need to consider when we're talking about saltmarsh restoration, and particularly when we're talking about that from a carbon benefit point of view. So maybe those questions aren't 100% clear right now, but hopefully they will become clear as we go on a little bit. So the first question, how much carbon is stored and why does it vary? So maybe it's good to go back a little bit to how the carbon is stored in the first place on salt marshes. And as I say, I won't dwell on this for too long because I think there's a lot of familiar concepts here, but maybe good to go over a bit. So generally, when we're talking about carbon uptake by the marsh, we're talking about two kind of overall processes, right? So we have autochthonous carbon sequestration, which is very much the direct uptake by the plants. and then that carbon is stored in the sediment either by litter deposition or directly through the roots. But then we also have this allochthonous input of carbon onto the salt marsh, where sediment's coming in at high tide and is deposited and trapped on the marsh. So that could be bringing in sediment that contains organic matter from other ecosystems or from the open ocean, and then that eventually is stored on the marsh as well. And usually when we kind of talk about carbon accumulation rates, that encompasses both of those two processes. So the carbon that's directly drawn in by the plants, but also what settles on the marsh. But there might be times where it becomes important to distinguish between those, which we'll think about a little bit more later on. So bear that in your mind. But also across the marsh profile, there's some other fluxes that we should think about. So for example, we have emissions of carbon dioxide, so carbon loss from the sediment. And we can also have emissions of other greenhouse gases, so methane and nitrous oxide flux. And those also become a little bit important to think about when we're restoring a salt marsh. So very much a whistle-stop tour of carbon storage. I appreciate that. But particularly worth bearing in mind, because we'll come back to it later, is the sense of the autochthonous carbon storage and the allochthonous carbon storage. So I wanted to start by showing this figure, just to really show how much research in this area has increased over the last few years. It's kind of gone a bit nuts, and there are loads of papers. So this figure is specifically on including papers that focused on drivers of carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes in natural or restored marshes. So already quite a specific criteria. And if we go broader and we just talk about marsh restoration, for example, or marsh carbon without a restoration point of view, then there's probably even more than that. So you can see how much research in the area has grown. And then arguably you can ask, well, if there's that many papers on it and we're doing that much about it, then what is there actually left to know? Which is a very good question. And one we thought about a lot when we were starting off with this kind of research. But what I will say is that what's grown at just as fast a pace, if not even a quicker pace, than research in this area is the attention surrounding it, and particularly the kind of political attention surrounding carbon offsetting schemes and even carbon credit trading schemes. So by that, we mean, for example, a way to say, the same as when you might offset the greenhouse gas emissions of your flight, right? You can say, okay, we're going to plant this many trees and that will offset it. And that's been kind of carried forward to blue carbon ecosystems to say, could we do a similar thing where we say, if we restored this many hectares of salt marsh, how much carbon dioxide will that take in? And can that be used to kind of sell credits in some kind of trading scheme? But to do that, we really need to have quite a robust evidence base beneath it, because it's really important that if we do offsetting, then we're not overestimating how much we offset, because then those emissions continue and we start to have a bit of a problem. So we really then do need a growth of an evidence base for that, and to properly be able to answer the question of, is there really a carbon dioxide uptake benefit from restoring salt marshes? So with that in mind, in 2021, the UK Salt Marsh Carbon Code was launched. So that's led by Annette Burden from UKCEH, but very much with a team from across a few different organisations. So Bangor University, for example, and WWT, RSPB, Jacobs, Finance Earth. So a real group of people to look at both the kind of scientific evidence side of this topic, but also the potential for coming up with a kind of financial trading scheme. So the project is split into two phases. Phase 2 is happening currently, and now they're actually drafting UK Salt Marsh Carbon Code. Phase 1 was before that, and that was where I was involved. So that was very much a feasibility analysis of saying, is it necessary to draft a UK Salt Marsh Carbon Code? Is it feasible to use other codes from different parts of the world and apply those? And then in the part I was involved with, creating an evidence synthesis. So saying, is there a way actually to predict, let's say, how much carbon will be stored by salt marsh restoration in a particular area? So what do we need to know to actually say how much carbon is going to be there? So we did that first in the UK and Northwestern Europe, and then later expanded it a little. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK review that we did. So this was the report, which is not very interesting actually to see the front cover of, but to introduce it, it was a systematic review and a meta-analysis to collate some data on carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes in both natural and restored salt marshes. So perhaps an important thing to lead with is to talk about how we defined natural and restored marshes, because I think there's a lot of conversation about that already, and it's an important conversation to have. So here we defined a natural marsh as a marsh that would have established or has established in that area anyway and remains there without a huge amount of active intervention, and a restored marsh to be an area usually that was previously reclaimed land that via some kind of intervention has been able to re-establish there. But there's some caveats to that. there's very few salt marsh sites that haven't experienced some kind of human impact and are completely natural. It's also not necessarily right to say that a restored marsh is inherently unnatural. So some caveats to bear in mind here, but that's where we define them in our study. So in this first review, we wanted to ask a couple of questions. So firstly, what factors were controlling carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes in natural and restored marshes? Secondly, we really wanted to look at how much carbon accumulation rates change in a restored marsh over time. So whether they stay fairly constant or whether we see quite large changes over the first few years. And then finally, we looked a little at whether there are current standardized methods for monitoring carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes, particularly in restored sites. Again, because for this kind of carbon code or an offsetting scheme, then having a kind of consistent set of data about what's happening in these restored marshes is quite important. So that last question is something I won't really talk about today, but it's in the report, so feel free to read it if you like. So we did this and we came up with a few pretty simple maps across the UK and Northwestern Europe. So here, for example, you can see carbon accumulation rate, although note that this is in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent rather than in tons of carbon. So at this point, one dot is just one observation, and the size of the dot is proportional to the size of the flux. So in this case, carbon accumulation rate. So we did that for carbon, and we also mapped out a few greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide fluxes, but also methane flux and nitrous oxide. And what I will say about nitrous oxide and methane is that the fluxes of these are often very small proportionally to carbon accumulation, so kind of initially might not seem super relevant, but it's really good to note how much greater the global warming potential is of these two gases relative to carbon dioxide. So I think for nitrous oxide, it's something like 273 times greater, and for methane, it's 27 to 30 times greater than carbon dioxide. So even a relatively small emission of these greenhouse gases can have quite a big warming influence. So we also wanted to include those. And the main things to kind of note from this are that we could pick out a couple of hotspots, let's say, of carbon accumulation or greenhouse gas flux. So for example, there's quite a big dot down here, which is the Steart marshes in the southwest of the UK. And at the point that we gathered this data, it was also still really a relatively newly restored site, which is most likely why the carbon accumulation rate is so high. But what we also really picked out from these maps is that we just have a lot of gaps, right? We have, especially when you look at the greenhouse gases, we have hardly any dots, which is a bit of an issue, and something we come back to a bit later. The other thing, as I mentioned, was that we wanted to look at carbon accumulation rates when we restore the marsh, so just the kind of raw sediment carbon accumulation rate. And we saw, as we expected, that accumulation rates are really fast when a marsh is newly restored. That's, again, not a big surprise to anybody, because when the marsh is first restored, there's very fast sediment accretion, and that allows the marsh to build up carbon quite quickly. But we really expected that to slow over time as the accommodation space decreases and accretion slows down. And we kind of did see that, but as you can see, it's not significant, and we just have this huge lack of points after 20 years, because most of the restored marshes we have been restored in the last 20, 30, 40 years. So we only had these 3 data points after 20 years, and that kind of leaves quite a big question of what's actually happening to carbon accumulation rates after that in a restored marsh. And then finally, as I mentioned, we wanted to see a little bit which elements of the context of the marsh we needed to be looking at to explain some of the variation in all of these different fluxes. But if you cast your mind back to those maps that I just showed you, there are a lot of gaps, and there's not enough data points really to properly explore those. So we couldn't really pull out very many patterns. And there's almost no doubt that a lot of these things, like the morphology of the marsh or the elevation or climate factors, so the latitude and the temperature and the rainfall, there's kind of no doubt that some of those things or all of those things will influence these fluxes to an extent. But we just really needed more data to be able to figure out how they were influencing carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes. So that led us to our next project, and we zoomed out a little bit and we thought, how can we get more data? Well, we'll include more marshes, which we did. So we zoomed out and we did a global review, which is very much the focus of the paper also that Jonathan was talking about before. So you can see already that if we look at global marsh extent, so from this map from Thomas Worthington and co in 2023, then we have just a huge expanse of marshes, and we have way more data points. So we thought if we can include and collect data from this kind of range of areas, then we not only have more data, but we have data that encompasses a much wider range of these contextual variables that we were looking at. So we have a way larger range of tidal ranges, of morphologies, of climates, of vegetation species. So we just kind of saw a much bigger opportunity there to try and pick out some of the patterns that we were looking at. And that's what we did. And that led us to our global review. So this was very much a continuation of the work that we were doing with the UK Saltmarsh Carbon Code. But I should say a little bit that it was made possible from some extra funding from WWT and from Blue Marine Foundation, which was very nice and allowed us to do as a team very much what we did on this paper. So again, we did a systematic review and a meta-analysis, and we were asking the question of what factors or what conditions or what drivers altered carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes in both natural marshes and restored marshes. So we included studies that only talked about natural marshes, but we were particularly targeting those that would give comparisons between natural and restored sites. And by factors, we mean anything from how a restored marsh was restored, which was hugely variable, but also things like the climate and the vegetation and so on. And we collected data on all of those same fluxes again, so the carbon stock itself, but also on the carbon accumulation rates, and then the carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide fluxes. And then finally, we of course collected a lot of data about the sites and metadata surrounding them and the papers, and also quite crucially how that data was collected. So by including data on quite a lot of things, then we had a very broad data set, and that does subject you to some variability in how that data is collected, especially when you do it globally, because methods vary quite wildly. But the strength of it is it gives you a much bigger and much more encompassing data set. So the idea was to try and have that to pick out some of those patterns. So we designed a search to allow us to do that, and we ran that search in January 2022, and that popped out just short of 30,000 search results. So then the next step in the plan was to screen those manually by title and by abstract, and then by the full text. So that's what we did until our eyes became a little bit like this, but thankfully it wasn't just me doing that, so that was very nice. And eventually we whittled that list down to 431 papers. From those 431 papers, we extracted as much data as we could from the text and from the figures and from the tables on all of those things you saw on the previous slide. And the data set we had looked something like this. So this is just the number of papers that come from any given country, and the dot is kind of in the midpoint of that country, which is why some of them aren't on the coast. But you can really see that, yes, we still have a lot of points from that kind of Northwestern Europe area, but actually now we had quite a good spread around the world. So we managed to achieve a little bit what we wanted to in spreading that data out and including some more different areas. So the first thing we wanted to do was just say how much of that data that we collected is about natural marshes and how much of it is about restored marshes. And you can see already there's way more data for natural marshes, unsurprisingly, because there's also just a lot more of them and a much larger area of them. So we plotted that, and you can also see that the restored sites tend to cluster in certain parts of the world. So there's more restored areas in Northwestern Europe and in the east coast of the States and also in China. But from those data points, we then managed to plot out a little bit what was happening to our different fluxes. So here you can see the carbon stock, as well as the carbon density in the sediment, but also the carbon accumulation rate, and then the fluxes of the three different greenhouse gases that we were talking about. And there's quite a lot there to unpick, and very much not expecting you to look at all of it right now. But I think a couple of key things to note from that figure are that the carbon accumulation rate, so panel D in here, is significantly higher in restored marshes than it was in natural marshes. But when you look at the carbon stock, so the actual standing stock in the marsh, then it's about the same in a natural marsh to a restored marsh. So that very much indicates that despite the fact the accumulation rate is higher, at some point that must be reaching a kind of equivalent to the natural marsh. Otherwise, eventually it would also reach a greater carbon stock than the natural marsh. So you can see that something must be happening kind of in between there that we're perhaps not capturing, which is quite interesting. The other thing to note is that obviously the error bars on here are huge, right? So here it's standard deviation, and it shows how much variation there is around these values. Again, unsurprisingly, but the next step was to try and explore what was actually leading to all that variation and how we can maybe explain some of it. And the first thing we wanted to do was say, okay, for the restored marshes, does it make a difference actually how we restored them? Which turned out to be quite an interesting endeavour, because what's defined as restoration, again, varies a lot by location and also just by when it was done and the site. So we had to do a little bit of grouping here, and we grouped into 6 different categories. So quite broad categories, and there are some points that overlap. But we had methods such as applying artificial structures onto the marsh, often to kind of reduce the tidal flow or to increase sedimentation, or both. Marsh creation, here we defined as employing multiple techniques. So there were sites where there had been sediment supplementation as well as planting, for example. Tidal reintroduction, which we see a lot around the UK, for example. We included managed realignment and regulated tidal exchange. And then we had a few sites where, for example, instead of reintroducing the tides, then river flow was diverted. So that was freshwater introduction. And you see already just from looking at where these points are, there's some patterns and some trends on different parts of the world leaning more towards one method or another. But what we really wanted to know from that, of course, was whether that made a difference to the carbon and greenhouse gas fluxes. And in short, it did, which was interesting to see. So on this figure that you're looking at, all of the fluxes are converted into the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent so that they're comparable. And any value that's above 0 represents an emission from the marsh. Any value that's below 0 represents some kind of uptake. And then we group by those restoration strategies that you just saw. So for freshwater reintroduction, for example, where the river was diverted, then we do see that the methane emissions kind of dwarfed the carbon accumulation from that marsh. And that's not a big surprise, because we know that part of the carbon benefit that we get from salt marshes is because methane production is inhibited by the salinity of the water. So if we introduce fresh water instead and we have a much fresher environment, then we don't have that inhibition. And then we do have a bit more to think about there. But actually from the other techniques, from marsh creation, sediment alteration and tidal reintroduction indeed, then we almost always had quite a large net uptake of carbon, which was really good to see. And then beyond that, we just wanted to know actually how much carbon was there. So we calculated an estimate by different continents, and then we came up with our global total, which was somewhere between 1.4 and 2.4 petagrams of carbon stored, and that's down to a metre in salt marsh sediment. And those estimates are quite in line with others that have come up recently. So I think Peter Macready's estimate was 1.35 petagrams, and Ralph Temming's was 1.37. So we're very much on the same lines in our lower estimate. Our upper estimate we suspect is higher because we used slightly newer global coverage estimates that incorporated more polar marshes, because before we'd been struggling quite a lot to get extent estimates of salt marshes in polar regions. But now, because we have more remote sensing techniques, we have a slightly better idea of that. But indeed, what you also see from this map is that there's big variation in the carbon flux between, carbon stock between different continents. The vast majority of that actually just comes down to the aerial coverage of the marsh on that continent. But we did then run a lot of different models to look at what was driving variation in these different areas. And for example, for carbon stock, the type of vegetation, as well as the time since restoration and the climate, so the annual average temperature in that country, made quite a big difference to the carbon stock. And we did that for all the different fluxes, which I won't dig into them all here, but it was very interesting to see how much some of those things did make a difference. So then maybe to go back to our first question, how much carbon is stored? Well, now we can give an estimate to that of somewhere between 1.4 and 2.4 petagrams. And we know that the climate benefit of restored marshes might depend quite heavily on how we restore it. So I think that's really something to think about if we are restoring specifically for carbon benefits, which is not to say we necessarily should be, but where that is our goal, then actually thinking about how we restore the marsh makes a really big difference. And finally, the context also matters. So the climate in the area, the vegetation species that are growing on the restored site, and just time since you've restored it actually influence the carbon stock quite heavily. But then we've talked a little bit about what we knew and what we found out, which is very nice. But as I say, I think arguably of equal importance is to talk about what we don't know. And the benefit of trying to do a global analysis like this is you really quickly see where the roadblocks are and you realise what data you wish you had and you didn't have. So it kind of gave some nice ideas and really brought to light some interesting discussions about what we wanted to know next. And I will say, I think most of these actually directions where the field is already very much turning. So I think they represent a really positive outlook in salt marsh carbon research. But the first thing, and perhaps the most obvious, is that we just have a lack of data in certain regions. So already we know that we have a big lack of data from marshes at much higher latitudes. And previously, as I say, we didn't really know marsh extent there as much, and that's already really improved since we have more remote sensing techniques. But even with that, it's still very difficult to collect in situ calls or anything like that to get carbon stock from those marshes, just because logistically they're very difficult to get to. So we have a big lack of data from those areas. And we also had a real scarcity of data from Africa and from South America. And while it's likely that those values didn't alter our estimates too heavily because the global coverage, the coverage in those areas is small compared to the global total, then if we really want to unpick the contextual drivers of variation, then we do need more data from those places. So I think that's a really important gap to try and start filling. The other thing, and one that we've talked about already, is the time since restoration. So we can picture that graph already from the UK review, where we had those 3 quite isolated points after 20 years. But that was very much the same kind of case when we thought about it globally. And actually, we still don't really know how long it takes for a restored marsh to reach functional equivalence to a natural marsh, which is not something that's limited to carbon storage, but also not totally sure in terms of flood defense, sediment stability, or vegetation extent, and indeed in terms of biodiversity as well. So it's something that would be very interesting to look at more. And Annette Burden, for example, did this a little bit, so combining some field data and some model data from Tollesbury Salt Marsh in the southeast of England. And there they estimated that it takes approximately 100 years for the carbon stock in a restored marsh to reach that in a natural marsh. But right now we're just lacking a little bit of field data to be able to explore that properly. So it would be very good to get that over time. I know that there's some quite interesting work done already with looking at sites that were breached much earlier on, so kind of accidental or unmanaged realignments. And I think that's also a really interesting direction to go with that. And the final thing, and one that we have really discussed very extensively as we were doing this and also since, is the ability to distinguish between different kinds of carbon inputs on our salt marsh. So again, I bring back this figure from the beginning, where we have our autochthonous inputs via the vegetation and our allochthonous inputs from sediment deposition. And both of these can certainly be attributed in a sense to the kind of climate benefit or the carbon benefit of the salt marsh, because even if the sediment and the organic matter is coming in externally, the salt marsh helps to trap it, which is great. So perhaps if we're restoring a marsh for biodiversity or for flood defense or for whatever else, and we're just recognizing the carbon benefit, maybe it's not necessary to distinguish further between those two things. And right now in the IPCC carbon accumulation rates, they don't distinguish between those two things. So that might be fine. But where the problem starts to arise is if we do use things like these carbon offsetting schemes, then what happens if the organic matter in the incoming sediment was drawn down, let's say, by a seagrass, and it was accounted for there, and then we account for it again on a salt marsh, and then we have this real risk of double accounting the carbon. So then we need to know and be able to distinguish between what carbon in the sediment has actually been drawn down by the salt marsh itself and what's come from another system. And that's quite difficult to do, and certainly in the data we had at this point was not possible to distinguish between on this kind of global scale, but I think really might become quite necessary in the coming few years. But indeed, it's good to just know what's necessary for your project, right? In some cases that might not be necessary, and in some cases it might. So it becomes really important then just to define what the objective of your restoration is and what you really need to know. And that is a theme that I think we see quite generally, is really the importance of having really clearly defined definitions and also really clearly defined goals. So what are the objectives of restoring a site? What do we mean when we talk about restoring it? And that really tells us what data we need to be able to kind of do that successfully, and particularly what data we need to prioritize and what we need first. So to summarize again for our second question then, what don't we know? And interestingly, maybe what do we want to know? I think it's really important that we start to fill in some of the gaps of the fluxes and stocks in areas where we just don't have data yet. Getting longer term values for restored sites, which of course also gets easier as time goes on because they just get a bit older. And then finally, really distinguishing between the carbon source and defining the goals for different restoration projects that are occurring. The other reason, of course, that we should define a little bit what we're trying to achieve with the restoration is that the way we do that and the approach that we implement really determines what ecosystem services we get from that marsh. And often there's a trade-off in those things. So in a really ideal world, then there would be one kind of winning restoration approach that simultaneously maximizes carbon storage, does brilliant things for biodiversity, and is the most beneficial for flood defence. But of course, normally life's not that simple. So we have situations where different approaches will benefit different ecosystem services. So to pull an example from the data that we had in this report, we saw that areas with Phragmites, so a reed that's normally in kind of brackish areas on the higher marsh, where we had Phragmites, we nearly always had the highest carbon stocks, also because of the elevation it's at. But let's say we're simplifying here. If you really wanted to maximize your carbon stocks, maybe you want a marsh where you have a lot of Phragmites. But the flip side of this is that in other parts of the world, Phragmites removal is defined as restoration because Phragmites is invasive. So then removing Phragmites will actually improve your biodiversity because you're getting rid of the invasive species. And then, of course, that's two things. You also have a whole other list of different services that will probably be influenced in different directions by this. So actually, what you do will almost always drive a trade-off in these ecosystem services, and what the right move is to do really just depends on what you're trying to achieve. So that kind of leads me on to the last theme that I thought I'd talk about a bit, and that's the third question of what trade-offs do we need to consider in salt marsh restoration and just kind of in ecosystem services science generally. So again, to take a step back and define what we're talking about by a trade-off. And here, I think we can take that as just anything that maybe has a differing effect on different services or on different traits. And we know that at any given point in time, there are a huge number of trade-offs occurring everywhere. So if we take our example of Phragmites, then it's relevant when we think about planting, but there's also on salt marshes everywhere, zonation of different vegetation species, for example. And some of those species will be better at one thing and some will be better at another. So for our Phragmites, we had our carbon storage and our biodiversity. And all of those variations in which ecosystem services maximized are there all the time and are very much not inherently a problem, right? That's just kind of how nature exists. And they only really start to become relevant when we really want to quantify, or indeed if we want to kind of, finance ecosystem services, that's when it really becomes relevant to start thinking about these trade-offs. And if we want to do that, and particularly if we want to project how they're going to be, then we also need to think about how trade-offs will emerge over time. Because realistically, we're not living in a time where the conditions that marshes or anything is under are static and continuous, but actually we're living in very much a changing time, which we know. So if you look, even these are all news reports from the last 2 weeks. And in different parts of the world at the same time, we have heat waves in the headlines, we have droughts in the headlines, we have floods in the headlines. We even have in the mainstream news a growing recognition of sea level rise in salt marshes and coastal ecosystems. So we have all of these processes happening, and all of them will have impacts on not just the marsh on the whole, but also on the ecosystem service it delivers. And same thing again, right? If all of those different climate change effects have the same kind of effect on every ecosystem service, then maybe it's not easy to manage to maximize those, but it is easy to see what we should be doing to do that, because we can make the same decision for every service. But actually, often the effects will be different on different things. And then how do we come up with any kind of management plan or restoration plan in the face of that? So with that, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the work that I'm doing now. So since I've left Bangor and been working at the NEOS, so as I mentioned already, then I'm now doing my PhD here, and that's within a project called Living Dikes. So in Living Dikes, the focus is on realising the potential of salt marshes within flood defence schemes, so nature-based solutions from a slightly different angle. So for me, a slightly different perspective, but very much the same principles applying as we were thinking about in restoring for carbon benefits. And within the project, there's lots of different people looking at lots of different things. So we have people looking at, for example, the historical use of salt marshes, also the kind of social elements of what we need to do to be able to upscale and implement nature-based solutions. And then we have some people looking at how well marshes actually work for attenuating waves and working as a flood defence. And then finally, we have somewhere in this corner is where I work, which is to do with wetland stability and the resilience, as we say, of marshes to different global change effects. So not just how the marsh will be affected, but specifically how the ecosystem services will be affected and which trade-offs we need to consider to be able to project this in the future. And we're thinking about quite a few different global change effects when it comes to that. And I mean, we could write a long list of these as well. But for here, we focus on droughts, on storms, and on sea level rise. So droughts, for example, yeah, this year maybe not, but actually in 2023 and 2022 in the Netherlands and in the UK, we had really quite major droughts. So this picture I took on a salt marsh in June last year in the Western Scheldt in the Netherlands. So definitely something we're already seeing happening quite a lot. But we also see an increasing frequency and perhaps intensity of storm events, as well as, of course, sea level rise. So here to tell you a little bit of a story of what I've been doing recently, I'm going to focus on sea level rise, which is, of course, particularly relevant if we look at coastal systems like marshes. So we very much know that on the whole, marsh response and marsh resilience to sea level rise depends quite heavily on the relative rate of sea level rise, but also on the incoming sediment supply and the space to migrate landwards. And those will probably be some of the biggest things that determine whether the marsh kind of maintains its area and keeps up. But we, of course, have some areas where the marsh won't keep up with sea level rise, either because the relative rates of sea level rise are higher, so for example, in areas that are subsiding from gas extraction, or because sediment supply is extremely limited. So for example, here in the Eastern Scheldt in the south of the Netherlands, we have a more limited sediment supply, which perhaps limits the ability of the marsh to accrete and keep up. So in those areas, the marsh itself will be gradually subjected to much longer inundation periods and indeed higher hydrodynamic conditions. And we thought that was a good opportunity to explore then what that does to different ecosystem services and to try and see if we could pick out some of these trade-offs starting to emerge. Which is what we did. So we did a field experiment last summer looking at how rising sea levels, so here specifically increasing inundation duration, impacts carbon storage and coastal protection in salt marshes. So we took proxy measures for each of these ecosystem services. So for carbon storage, actually here, we weren't looking at accumulation rates, but we wanted to know what happened to carbon loss and carbon decomposition from a system where flooding time increased. And then for coastal protection, we took that from 2 points of view. So we know that for a marsh to be effective in flood defence, it needs to have an erosion-resistant sediment so that it won't just wash away immediately in a storm, for example. So we looked at the stability of the sediment or the erosion resistance, and we also looked at the strength of the vegetation itself. So where the vegetation stems are attenuating waves, then a taller and stiffer stem is generally better, reducing those waves as they're incoming. So we wanted to see whether actually the vegetation itself was starting to grow structurally differently under higher inundation regimes. And to do so, we went to a site that you can see on the picture here called Perkpolder in the Western Scheldt, so also in the southwestern Netherlands. And Perkpolder is a really cool site and really interesting because it's really, really very low, right? So it was a former agricultural area. It was reflooded in 2015, and it's very, very sheltered. So you can see already on this slide that it's got this seawall around it on 3 and actually a little bit more than 3 sides. So it's very sheltered from the local hydrodynamic conditions. And what that means is despite the fact that the bed level is quite low, then where there are Spartina anglica tussocks, these are able to survive at much, much lower elevations than where we see them anywhere else in the estuary at all. So actually, some of the highest tussocks, and they're the blobs you can see in this picture, the highest tussocks at Perkpolder are roughly around the lowest level that we would see the same species anywhere else in the same surroundings, which is quite nice because it gives us this area where we have a gradient of vegetation patches growing at different inundation regimes. And then we could see as they're flooded for longer, does that make a difference? So we're kind of asking the question of if current marsh edges were then subjected to longer and longer flooding times, what would happen? And that's what we use these patches for. So we took 6 of the tussocks on this gradient, and then we used measures for each of our 3 ecosystem services. So for carbon decomposition, we use the teabag index, which many of you will also know. So I, again, won't delve too far into, but it's a really fun method. It involves, so you use teabags of a known composition. So you use rooibos green and Lipton green and Lipton rooibos teabags, and you know exactly the chemical composition of those. And the green teabag is much more labile, so it degrades a lot faster. And the rooibos teabag is much more recalcitrant, so it degrades a lot more slowly. And by burying both of those, and then you leave them in there for 90 days, dig them back up, dry them out and weigh them, then the relationship between the mass loss in each of those tea bags allows you to calculate the carbon decomposition rate without having to do multiple burials over time, which is really nice. So we did that to look at how fast the carbon was breaking down. But we also measured at each of the tussocks the stability of the sediment. So we did that with some proxy measures, like the shear strength of the sediment using a shear vane and the penetration resistance of the sediment. So using a penetralogger that you push into the soil and you see how resistant it is, as well as by harvesting some vegetation stems themselves. And then we did some 3-point bending tests on those to see how flexible they were, as well as looking at, of course, at just how thick they were and how tall they were and how many stems were in the area. And from that, I wanted to just briefly summarize some of the results. So where we looked at carbon decomposition, you can see that actually you have maybe a bit of a positive impact. So on this figure, on the x-axis, you can just see the inundation duration increasing, and then on the y-axis is the decomposition rate. So a faster or a higher decomposition rate means the carbon's breaking down and being released faster. And actually there you see that as the inundation duration starts to increase, then the carbon loss or the carbon decomposition slows down, which we kind of expect because the sediment becomes more waterlogged and more anoxic. It's quite interesting, I think, that the decomposition is always slower where there's vegetation because the Spartina roots are just very good at oxygenating the soil. So that seems to really mitigate that effect of the rising sea level. But generally, you see the same pattern, just to a different extent. And when you look at the stabilization factor, so that's the carbon becoming recalcitrant and then theoretically more permanently stored, then you see the opposite effect. So the carbon's becoming more stable where the inundation duration is higher. So arguably, actually, a bit of a positive effect, at least in the short term, of the sea level rising. But when you start to look at the sediment stability, then the story starts to change somewhat. And you have quite a negative impact. So here you're just looking at the peak penetration resistance, so the kind of hardest part to push into the sediment at any given point. And that decreased quite strongly with rising inundation duration. So the sediment was becoming less stable. And we saw very much the same thing with shear strength. So on that panel, you just see different depth measurements going down. So you have 0 centimeters at the surface and then 10 centimeters depth 20. And with all of them, the higher the inundation duration got and the wetter the sediment became, the less stable the sediment became, which is very much can be seen as a negative impact for flood defense because that sediment is arguably becoming more easily erodible. And for vegetation, it was the same, sadly. So where we had higher inundation durations, we just had much shorter stems, also generally narrower diameters, so kind of thinner and shorter. And we also saw, although to a way lesser extent, so there's huge variation around the stiffness, but even the stiffness was slightly lower where the inundation was higher. So we had kind of slightly more flexible stems that would then just bend under wave action. So our wave attenuation arguably was also slightly less where inundation was higher. So we kind of did then see a bit of a trade-off, right? In that first instance that we say, okay, we have a negative impact on the strength of the vegetation and also on the sediment stability, but maybe there's a little bit of a silver lining to that where we see something positive coming out for carbon storage, at least for a little while. But then I think where that changes is if you start to think about how those impacts interact with each other. Because if we take sediment stability, for example, if we have a sediment that's much more likely to erode, let's say under a storm event, which probably also becoming more frequent, then if that sediment that's containing the stored organic matter, if that becomes eroded and re-released into the water column, then that's far more likely to have that carbon then degraded and re-released. So actually, from that interaction between them, if we have the sediment eroding, we probably have a greater loss of carbon even through that. So then we start to shift in this trade-off over time. And I think, you know, this is very much one site and it's also very much only looking at 2 services with proxy measures, but I think it already starts to show the importance of looking not just individually at each of the ecosystem services, but how they'll play off each other if you really want to kind of see what's going on with them. And that applies not just to the different ecosystem services, but of course to all the different global change effects, so droughts and storms and sea level rise, and they'll all impact a very long list of ecosystem services. And indeed, the impacts will be different across lots of different contexts. So all of those things, there's probably trade-offs between what's occurring within them and arguably quite a complicated web to try and untangle. But I think if we really want to try and project what's happening to ecosystem services over the coming years, that's quite an important thing to try and look at and quite an interesting challenge to try and solve, I would say. So for what trade-offs do we need to consider? Then I think it's just all of those things, right? It's looking at multiple stresses, it's looking at different ecosystem services, and indeed looking at trade-offs across different contexts, different areas, and different marsh typologies. So that's really what I had to say, but I just wanted to conclude by going back to the 3 questions that I brought up at the beginning. So we talked about how much carbon is stored, and we have a bit of an estimate for that, but we also know then that the climate and the vegetation, for example, and how we restore a marsh plays a really big part in determining that number. I think some really good steps would be trying to fill in some of the gaps with where data scarcity is, for example, particularly geographically, but also with older restored marshes, and particularly distinguishing between carbon sources and looking at trade-offs and interactions together to really understand how they'll start to play off each other as time goes on. So that was everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much again for having me. It's been very nice to be here. Please fire away with any questions you have.
Great, thank you, Victoria. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, lots of us to think about there. We actually have some questions already in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat, Victoria.
Yeah, I can.
In the meantime, if anyone would like to raise their hand to ask a question or to type their own question in the chat, please do so. But perhaps we can start with these questions that have come in the chat. So Tanya White, hi Tanya, comments on a study that's been done at the University of Brighton looking at Shoreham, and then asks, does Phragmites switch to carbon emitting when unhealthy? For example, when used in suds, is there work on harvesting this to maintain carbon sequestrating state, please?
Yeah, really good question. I have absolutely no idea what Phragmites does when it becomes unhealthy. So I don't know if I have a very interesting question for you, but I think it would be certainly quite interesting to look at. And I think also it kind of ties in with some of the different global change effects things, right? Because I think also, so we've done some work looking at the droughts, for example, and how they affect different species. And some of them actually didn't really react to that and become unhealthy at all. And some of them really do. So I can imagine that that will make a really big difference, particularly where decomposition rates change, for example, or where productivity decreases. And then the balance between these two processes, I can imagine will play off quite a lot. But specifically for Phragmites, I don't actually really know.
Well, maybe there's a knowledge gap there that we need to
Yeah, indeed.
investigate. So looking at the rest of the chat, it seems to be more sort of comments and things that might be worth following up after the webinar. But whilst we see if there are any more questions, I do have a question. Or maybe more of a query rather than a question. So as you stated, in restored sites, we would expect there to be quite a rapid amount of sediment accretion at first. And you talked about sturt, which there's been more than a meter of accretion in places at sturt. But that obviously will slow down with time. And whilst that happens, vegetation, in theory, should be colonizing and becoming established. So at what point do we switch from maybe carbon being stored because of sediment accretion and moving more towards vegetation dominating and driving carbon storage? Do we know? Is there a time point? Is there sort of a point where we can expect to see that change?
Yeah, really good question. I think definitely. So if we look at, for example, the figure from Annette Burden's paper where they were looking at carbon stock, then you can see that around that 100-year point, that's where the stock's becoming equivalent. And I would say certainly by that point, then the sequestration by the vegetation is really outweighing what's happening by sediment accumulation, because probably that's slowing down quite a lot. But I think actually it probably happens quite a long time before that. So I don't really know specifically what time it is. And I think that's one of the things really we need to try and figure out. But I suspect within the first 20 years or so, when carbon accumulation rate really starts to slow down, then the vegetation would really take over that quite quickly. But I think that will also change quite a lot with sea level rise, because then if the sea levels start coming up really a lot faster, then the marshes will continue, but where they can, they'll continue to accrete faster than maybe what we would have otherwise expected them to do after 20, 30 years, for example. So I can see that that time would maybe start to stretch out a little bit.
And obviously sediment availability is key as well to that.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Are there any more questions? If anyone wants to raise their hand or to put a question in the chat, please do so. If not, I do have one further question I could ask. whilst we wait and see if anyone does have questions. So one thing you didn't look at was size of the marsh.
Yeah.
And obviously, again, going back to Stoke, one of the UK's largest realignment sites, typically, they're not of that scale or magnitude. Do you think marsh size, particularly from a restoration point of view, has an impact? And can we account for that in maybe predictions of carbon accumulation within these sites?
I think it definitely makes a difference. I think also, especially because it very much affects the flow dynamics across the marsh, right? So, I mean, if you have a way wider extent, then, for example, you have way more flow attenuation before that reaches the upper marsh, and then perhaps you have less sediment deposition up there. So I think it's really something we should factor in. Also, depending indeed what species are on there, to what extent it's colonized, and at what point. But indeed, something that we didn't really take into account. We did try to, actually. We collected data on it, but we found that we were just missing many, many points on it, particularly even for restored marshes, actually. But I think it would be a good thing to try and take into account. And I think beyond that, also looking at it not just on the size of that site, but looking, so in estuaries, for example, looking at really what's happening across the estuary, because I think those scale processes will make, in many cases, even more of a difference. So, for example, where sediment supply is really impeded, whether that's naturally or whether that's by interventions like big dam building, then I think that will make as much, if not more, of a difference than what's happening on the site itself.
And I guess what we really need to be accounting for is sort of seascape scale processes, and
Yeah,
if you've got lots of little marshes, is that equivalent to one big marsh?
yeah,
And by
indeed.
can we account for that?
Yeah, and what's
Um,
playing off between different systems, I guess. Also, if we have a kind of system where we're looking at oyster reef restoration and seagrasses alongside marshes, whether that makes a big difference or not.
yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. Okay, well, I can't see any other questions. Oh, okay, we do have one. Go ahead.
Sure, yeah. I work for the Environment Agency, and it's nice to see put a face to the person because I've read your paper. I read the report that you mentioned, the guy that you guys did for the agency. So good to have a face now to refer. I was wondering if you have seen examples in the Netherlands that we could maybe learn from here in the UK.
Yeah, really good question. I think it's quite interesting because and perhaps this is more from the perspective of the project I'm working on now than the place, but I have the feeling sometimes here that the focus is slightly more on flood defense than it is on carbon storage compared to the UK, which I think is maybe a little bit contextual, given the elevation of the country. But I think it also means that maybe the focus and the techniques that are used can be slightly different. So there's indeed a few marshes, there's quite a few managed realignment sites around, but there's also some different techniques that have been used. So in the north of the Netherlands, there's a site where there's been lots of sediment supplementation, and they've been doing that in different orientations and also planting. So I think there's maybe a slightly greater range of techniques that have been used so far. And I think that's maybe something we could look at as well and see how they're playing off each other. I know there's also some research here at kind of comparing those methodologies and seeing what difference that makes for example, the stability of the sediment, but indeed also for the carbon. I think we could look at that and try to compare a bit.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Great, thank you. We've had a question come in the chat as well. So Caitlin asks, was previous land use looked at for the restored sites and did it make a difference?
Yeah, interesting. Yes, we did. So we collected data on how the land had been used. We also looked at how it's being used now, so whether the site's being grazed or not, which again varied quite a lot. We didn't look at what that would do for the biodiversity, just because it's not really something we were collecting the data on. And then in terms of the carbon storage and accumulation, again, it was quite patchy data. So we didn't quantify it so much, but we kind of looked at it and discussed it. And I think it indeed can make quite a big difference also with a restored marsh. So if, for example, it has been or is now being grazed, then the sediment is much more likely to be consolidated, at least if it's by quite large grazers like cows. So then that can kind of, compress it and then lower the elevation of the bed. So then there's potentially more space for sediment accumulation and thus the carbon accumulation over the top. So I think it's things that definitely make quite a large difference. I think also what the land was used for before can make a difference between what's being emitted from the sediment layer underneath. So I think something quite important to consider. But indeed, one of the things that we collected data on, but then didn't have a full enough set to really quantify it.
Great. So it sounds like there's lots of knowledge gaps still.
So many gaps to fill.
That we need to address, and hopefully that's something that in the coming years we can work on, and especially as sites get older. Yeah, I think that's going to contribute a lot to improving our understanding. Great. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you again, Victoria, for a very interesting and amazing presentation and some good discussion there as well. Our next webinar will be on the 7th of November on site-specific thresholds for storm-driven compound flooding in UK estuaries. And that talk is going to be by Charlotte Linden at the University of Liverpool. And then our final talk of the year will be on the 5th of December, and Craig Smeaton at St Andrews University will be talking about fjords and how they're a hotspot for carbon storage. So again, another carbon talk. So thank you everyone, and I look forward to seeing you for a future talk later on in either November or December. Thank you.